Cool. So we are going to talk about my favorite topic, so social cognition. So this is what I study. And so this is basically, there's two kind of components to social cognition, because a lot of people think it's just about studying other people, but it's really focused on what the self is and how the self is different than processing things about other people. So today we're going to get really into the self and information regarding the self. And then on Monday, we'll get into more of how we process other people. All right, so today we're going to start getting into social cognition. It's kind of amazing what we're able to do as humans. We are by far the most social, the most cooperative animal in the animal kingdom. And we think that a lot of that has to do with our frontal cortex. And so we're going to get into the prefrontal cortex and how it's split up. We'll talk about the default mode network, which is this inwardly focused processing network. We're going to start with what social cognition is in general and the brain regions that support it. So those brain regions that are involved in this kind of social network or inwardly focused processing network. We're going to look at ways that these social kind of things can be disrupted, these processes. And then we're going to spend most of the lecture exploring what the self is, and how it's processed, and how it's kind of defined, and what led to research about the self. This is a really, really heavily studied topic in social cognition. And this is something that I do a lot of in my work, is trying to distinguish differences between the self and the other, and what kind of processing separates the two. We're going to look at self-referential thought, so that's thought related to the self. We're going to look at how the self is kind of distributed. So there's different processes that kind of contribute to our overall idea of the self. And then we're going to look at embodiment. So our idea that like the body and the mind are kind of spatially united in some way, and that we kind of feel that all of this belongs to us. Cool. Social cognition. And we'll get kind of more into like what the definition of social neuroscience is here in just a little bit. But this is something that really involves being able to simulate your own ideas and simulate others to try to figure out what other people's intentions are, what their motivations are, try to think about what they're going to do next. There's a lot that goes into our social navigation, which is really, really complex. The brain regions that support this. So this picture over here is a picture of the default mode network, which we'll kind of describe here in a little bit. But the region that's really, really heavily involved in all of this social cognition is the prefrontal cortex. And we talked in the last lecture about the prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of the frontal lobe that's not involved in motor responses. So this isn't primary motor or supplementary or premotor. It's everything else. And you see kind of this whole area. So these two brains are the opposite directions. This is the back of the brain over here. This whole area in blue is all frontal cortex activity. And this is kind of lateral prefrontal cortex activity up on the top. It seems to be very right lateralized, or left lateralized, I'm sorry, which has a lot to do with like language and our understanding of language. Language seems to be very left lateralized. The self portion of this, I don't want you to memorize all of these different regions, but I do want you to know that the medial part of the prefrontal cortex is really, really heavily involved in self-referential thought, in who we are as a person. And we'll get into how that was discovered and why that's the case in a little bit. And then when we're thinking about others, you'll notice that we kind of have the same region here, this medial prefrontal cortex. There's a lot of people that think that we're using ourself as a template to understand others, and that might be why there's overlap here. This other region, I didn't have this highlighted in your guys' slides, but I do want you guys to kind of note the TPJ. We'll talk a lot about that on Monday. That's really, really important region for theory of mind type stuff, for trying to understand what other people are thinking and what their intentions are, things like that. And so you'll notice that these involve a lot of different regions. I mean, they're heavily involved with these like medial prefrontal cortex areas, but our ideas about ourselves, our ideas about other people involve memories, involve emotions, involve different actions and things that we see them doing. And so we're going to see a lot of those areas. You see with other, we have FFA, fusiform face area. So we're processing their emotions on their face and what they're thinking by looking at their face. And then the amygdala too kind of ties into like, are they trustworthy or not? Should we approach them or not? So really, really kind of complicated network. And we'll get into how the network was discovered here in just a little bit. Love this. You could tell I got a little baby crazy. So there was a study that was comparing humans to chimps. Chimps are like our closest relative in the primate family, them and bonobos. And we gave these 2.5-year-old humans and these 2.5-year-old chimps a series of cognitive tasks. And what we saw was that the humans and the monkeys performed really well, but they both performed really well on these tasks that kind of had things to do with the outside external world. So kind of remembering where things were and like tracking where people were going, knowing where like the location of a reward was hidden. They could understand cause and effect type things, and they knew what tools were used for and could do kind of simple quantitative reasoning with like small numbers and things like that. But what we saw was that humans vastly outperformed the chimps on social tasks, that they were doing things that were very heavily social that the chimps really weren't. And we'll look on Monday kind of at this idea of monitoring someone's attention. This is something that's very uniquely human. It's this idea of joint attention, that we actually track other people's gazes. And before this baby is even 1 year old, he is following exactly where mom and dad are looking and tracking where their attention is focused. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we have sclera, we have whites of our eyes, so we can actually see where the eyes are looking. Whereas with primates, they usually use just head motion. And something that humans can decipher is if the head is looking one way, but the eyes are looking another, it reveals something about intention, about what they're thinking. Because if they're looking a different way than their head is going, then they're probably kind of concealing something. And then they were really good too at kind of theory of mind stuff, kind of understanding what other people's intentions were, getting into like false belief tasks, which we'll talk about on Monday, of knowing that other people have a mind and a different perspective. So it kind of got at this idea that something is different about the human brain that really kind of boosts these social skills and allows us to be as cooperative and as successful as we are as a species. See, baby crazy. Really cute picture. And what we see throughout development is that the prefrontal cortex is still growing. This is something we talked about in the cognitive control lecture, is that the PFC is a very new structure evolutionarily. And what we see is that the newer structures take longer to develop. They're the last ones to develop. And so as these children grow and the PFC kind of gets more involved and more connected, we start to see things that are linked to maturity. And a lot of the things that we link to maturity are social skills, our ability to understand social rules, to have cognitive control, which is very linked to the prefrontal cortex. And what we see also is that when humans are really young, their brains are really, really sensitive to both negative type consequences and the positive ones. We're going to focus in these next couple of slides on kind of the disruptions in social cognition and what negative type trauma can do to the prefrontal cortex. But you got to keep in mind that their brains are very plastic at this point. A lot of these connections are still working their way out. And so if you deny them kind of social interaction or the right types of social rules and things like that, the prefrontal cortex kind of wires itself in a wrong way. That even if you re-socialize these people, they still have some deficits based on that trauma. I love this picture because it's just like, this is how we're social now. Like, I mean, it still worked. They're still together, I guess. There's still interaction happening. But it's very different, and it's going to be interesting. There's a lot of people that are kind of studying a new digital social realm. So this kind of gets into these disruptions, and a lot of work has kind of come out of the animal literature with rats. And we'll see on the next slide that there's a lot of what we found here that's really, really tied to loneliness in humans. And so if you socially isolate a rat, it really, really impedes their social development, the way that their PFC functions. And it ends up, they're really aggressive towards the other rats. They have a ton of fear and anxiety, so they're very neurotic and very easily scared and things like that. And what we see here, what I was just kind of hinting at, that if we isolate them while they're still growing and while the brain is developing and while that PFC is kind of learning what it needs to about the social world, that even after you re-socialize them, they have a really hard time rewiring those social cues and those social type behaviors. And what was really interesting, so a lot of this work was done by Cacioppo. He was like one of the first social neuroscience people. Tragically died a couple of years ago from an early disease. And he found that it wasn't just rats that were isolated, but it was also rats that were raised by non-playful parents, parents that didn't actually interact and play with the other rat. And these recordings showed that they were a lot less sensitive to dopamine. They weren't able to kind of learn from like reward signals and things like that. And so it tied a lot of these frontal cortex type interactions to these dopamine systems and showed that like all of this was kind of out of sync in these. They were very impulsive. Their decision-making capabilities were really inhibited. And this last point right here is going to come up again when we look at autism. This is a really interesting finding here, is that the rats that did play, their PFC was more pruned. And so they had kind of wired it in a certain way, and it was a lot less dense than the PFC of the rats that didn't get any play. And so we'll see that with autism. There's a lot of findings with autism that the prefrontal cortex has overgrowth, that there's a lot more PFC in autistic people than in normal healthy controls. And it may kind of be related to these kind of similar ideas. And so this is kind of a disturbing slide. I apologize ahead of time. But the study of isolation and loneliness has revealed so much about human behavior and human thought and emotion. I mean, you look at these people that have felt isolated for really long periods of time, felt really lonely, higher morbidity and mortality rates. There's blood pressure issues. There's metabolic issues of just processing the food that they eat, increased HPA activity. So that was the hypothalamic pituitary axis that kind of controls our cortisol levels. And so these people had increased cortisol in the mornings. So their HPA axis wasn't shutting down. They weren't getting out of those stress cycles. It was messing with their sleep. They ended up, because they weren't sleeping, they ended up with sedentary lifestyles. You see a lot of this in depressive symptoms and things like that. They had underexpression of anti-inflammatory genes and overexpression of inflammatory genes. And this is kind of more evidence that the physiology is kind of going haywire. And you have decreased immunity that kind of comes out of that. And at the end, kind of this diminished self-control, which kind of ties back to PFC dysregulation type stuff. This whole paragraph right here really, really demonstrates how important social behavior is to humans. Like, we rely on that so much for our physiology to work the way that it's supposed to. We rely on each other, on having each other's backs and cooperating and all of those kind of things. And when that falls away, we start to fall into this bad cycle, this stress cycle. And we saw also that these feelings of isolation, these feelings of loneliness were predictors of cognitive decline. They were predictors in IQ actually changing throughout the lifetime, which is supposed to be really stable. Worsening of depression symptoms. There were higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. And I don't know how much you guys have really got into regression and things like that, but they found these significant regression findings even when they were controlling for all these other social type things, marital status. They were controlling for depression. They were controlling for how big their social groups were and how much social activity they actually had. So this meant that just feeling isolated, just feeling lonely, above and beyond all of these other things, was what was contributing to these differences in cognitive abilities and differences in IQ and things like that. So just being social really promotes a ton of health in humans. And so what we see, so this was kind of evidence what we just looked at, of just kind of the feelings of not engaging in social stuff can kind of just cause those disruptions. But we can kind of add to that evidence by looking at people that have lesions to the prefrontal cortex and look at how their social behaviors are kind of affected. We had Phineas Gage, that his frontal lobe was disrupted and he turned into a completely different person, right? And a lot of this looks very familiar to what we saw with Phineas Gage, right? So they're blunted affect, so they don't really express emotion very well. They don't have obvious responses to things that people would consider arousing or emotional. And they don't really regret things. These are also symptoms of psychopathy, things like that, which we'll kind of get into here in just a minute. And I think that psychopathy symptoms also arise from these prefrontal cortex disruptions. These people were less inhibited, so they had a really hard time kind of shutting they couldn't filter things. So when you're in a conversation with one of these people, they might say really inappropriate things and not be able to kind of inhibit those actions. They don't really have social rules in mind at all times. They're frustrated really easily. They're very aggressive. And these ones right here that I have highlighted are the ones that I want you to know. There's a lot of kind of stuff here, but this less inhibited ties into what we talked about with cognitive control, the response inhibition with cocaine users. It's all kind of tied into frontal cortex type activity. And then these last ones, so immaturity is really tied into kind of the social side of this in general, that these people have a really hard time understanding the social rules and being able to monitor their own activity in any given moment. And this goal-directed behavior is also kind of tied to that cognitive control piece that we talked about with frontal cortex. And this was kind of an important part of it. If you're engaged in social conduct, if you're in a conversation, you really need to be able to, in that moment, understand whether or not what you said was inappropriate. Be able to feel embarrassed in the moment. These people don't. They still, we'll see later, they still kind of understand the social rules, but in the moment, those social rules aren't brought to mind, and they're not like actually comparing their actions to what they should be doing. So they really lack insight into whether or not what they're doing is acceptable or not. And so this is where I was kind of leading to with psychopathy, very, very similar to these antisocial personality disorders. And so these people with APD, they know what the social rules are. They can tell you what they're supposed to do, what they should do, all those kind of things, but they kind of fail to conform to them. So they can kind of have this mask on and they can appear very friendly, but they don't have your best intentions in mind. They kind of show indifference, right? They don't really care whether or not you're benefiting from anything. And they understand that other people, so if you give them these like theory of mind tasks and things like that, they know that other people have perspectives. They know that other people have feelings and all of these things, but they don't really care. They kind of lack this empathy type drive, right? And a lot of this has been linked to structural, so the actual size of these regions and the way that it's actually coming online. So if you're looking at these people while they're in an MRI, you're going to see very, very decreased prefrontal cortex activity. You also see, so ACC is the anterior cingulate cortex. We will talk a little bit about that. That's really tied to kind of positivity about the self and things like that. But very, very interesting that, like we've kind of hinted at through the entire course, and on the first day when I talked about how much our brain determines what we do. We feel like we're so in control of a lot of these things, but there's a lot of stuff under the hood that really biases the way that we act and the way that we choose to do things. And we live in a society that really wants to like punish people for what they do. And we maybe need to start rethinking that in a way when we start looking at how much influence the brain can actually have on behavior. I'm not saying that we don't have free will, but I think it's very limited. I think the word free is a very broad term. So autism, this is what I was hinting at on that rat slide. So when we look at patients that suffer from autism, we see a lot of these social cognitive deficits, right? They have really hard time understanding these social cues of when they're being inappropriate or when someone's kind of giving them some kind of a clue that they're not interested or anything like that. They have a hard time understanding social rules, niceties and things like that, things that are very culturally driven. And they have a really hard time with theory of mind. They have a hard time putting themselves in other people's perspectives and understanding that other people have their own mental state, their own ideas, and their own thoughts about how things should be. And a lot of this kind of comes out in this complete lack of wanting to interact with other people. Right? They kind of want to be isolated, which runs really counterintuitive to everything we just talked about in the last couple of slides. And what they found, this is what I was hinting at, they found that there was this overgrowth in the prefrontal cortex. And I mean, I'm kind of just out on a limb. The paper that I found that got into this didn't specifically tie this to the rat studies, but this may be tied to that lack of pruning through development, that there's just so much connection that didn't get whittled down to like actually highlight what was important, that it makes it really hard for the prefrontal cortex to really operate. And so that was the paper kind of concluded that they're not sure what was causing this overgrowth, but if you kind of link it to those animal studies, it could be very similar. And this last point was something that we actually talked about when we were looking at object recognition. We got into prosopagnosia and things like that. Fusiform face area, the FFA, was found to have a lot less neurons with autistic participants, autistic patients. And it's really hard with these types of findings to really like get into chicken or the egg type stuff. It's like, do they have less neurons because they haven't really paid attention to faces through their whole life, or were they born with less neurons and that caused them to not pay attention to people's faces? It's hard to work that out. All right, so we'll get into the self. Socrates, know thyself, right? We have this kind of insight into who we are and how we should be and what we should do and all of these kind of things. And a lot of our lives is spent trying to understand who we are. And what we'll see is that there are very specific kind of brain regions that really work a lot of this stuff out and really process the information that's related to the self, and that information is different than information that's just processed kind of passively through the other systems. So the self itself is really interesting because when we're thinking about the self, we're both the perceiver and the perceived, right? It's like, who is the self? Who's doing the thinking and who are we thinking about? It makes it a very kind of unique type of cognitive process that's very different than anything else that we kind of engage in. And it's kind of complex, right? So there's this physical you of like what you're composed of, what you look like, looking at yourself in the mirror, kind of understanding that's you in photos and things like that. But there's a lot to you that's not observable. And this really gets into your personality, your traits, your preferences, the things that you like to do, the things that you have done, your experiences, all of these memories that make you up. We have this really good ability as humans to tell a story about who we are, to keep track of everything that we've done before, right? And so it really involves kind of developing this store of information that's very self-specific. And it's something that I've talked with students about, and I've talked a little bit about through like the learning and memory type stuff, is that we learn the best when the information that we're trying to learn is self-relevant. If we're passionate about something, if we really, really enjoy a topic, that information sticks, right? If it's important to whatever our goals are and our intentions are, that's the stuff that we learn the best. And that's what we'll get into in these next couple of slides. I want to define really quick, this is something I hinted at the beginning of the lecture, what social neuroscience is, because we're focusing so much on the self, but we're also talking about social interaction. But the self is really, really important for social interaction. So a lot of this social neuroscience stuff is about being able to distinguish others. But that whole process is knowing that others are different than us, that others are different than the self, and that the information that's processed about the self is different than the information processed about others. And so this idea, social cognitive neuroscience as a whole, the way that it's kind of described and defined is processing both information about the self and others, and then finding where those mechanisms are same or different. So what kind of information about ourself may kind of overlap with information about others, and how the brain kind of differentiates that information, right? It's kind of interesting when you think about kids, about to have a kid. That kid is like me in a way, but not me. And like, how does my brain deal with that? Really interesting. A lot of people haven't studied that. We were just studying groups, and there's so many people that were like, have you studied families? I'm like, oh, that'd be so cool. Get a family in and like look at their brain while they're thinking about their brothers and sisters, and their mom and dad, and how that differs from when they're thinking about just people in their social network in general. Really, really interesting. And it's tough though, because like a lot of families, a lot of them are under 18, really hard to recruit, things like that. So a lot of that work hasn't been done because of those barriers, but it'd be really interesting to kind of get into that. And then the kind of last part of this is how these social contexts, how cultural influences and all of these other things kind of mediate and change these processes. So this is going to kind of lead into, so this slide is very learning and memory kind of focused, but this really ties into how the work on the self got started. So there were a lot of people that were studying this depth of processing idea, where this was kind of what I was just getting at, of like information that's processed more deeply, it's more meaningful, it's remembered better. And so they defined these stages, Tolvie, information that is passively viewed without kind of any intent or attention. It's kind of this shallow processing, right? Just kind of reading a chapter without really caring. You got Netflix on, it's like whatever. You're not going to remember any of that information. Intermediate processing is you're paying attention to it, but you're reading about like post-colonial whatever, and you don't care, right? That's kind of this intermediate processing. It's like the memorize and regurgitate, and then it's gone kind of stuff. Deep processing is where you've attended really highly to that information. You've compared that information to things that are in memory, and you've tagged that information as being important and as being meaningful. And what these researchers found is that as you kind of progress into these deeper processing stages, that your memory is really, really heavily increased. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because there were some early cognitive psychologists that decided to add another condition into these depth of processing type studies. And so they were instructed to remember words, but they were given these kind of cue questions of how they were supposed to encode it, right? So they were given some type of word, and then they were just asked, are they big letters or small letters, right? This was kind of the shallow processing. And then the kind of intermediate was like, you really have to pay attention to it to understand whether or not it rhymes with another word. So it's kind of getting deeper as far as processing. And then you got to this kind of semantic deep processing area where it's like, what does that word actually mean? Kind of think about it, compare it to other things that you've seen before. But these early cognitive psychologists, they threw in this last condition here. Does the word describe you? It added this like, is it kind of related to you? Is it important to you? And what they found was that as you got deeper, just like the other people were finding, the memory got better. But once you got to this condition, the memory was really, really enhanced. So if you had related that word to yourself, if you had really tried to understand whether that word was meaningful to you, it really stuck. And that's really important when you guys are studying all that kind of stuff. Like you really need to, and that's like with your papers, the reason I want you guys to like try to enjoy it in some way, try to relate it to something that you like, is because it's actually going to do something for you. And out of this whole idea, this depth of processing idea, these kind of conflicting camps emerge, these two different camps of like, what is the self? The first hypothesis was that what we're seeing in these studies is just depth of processing, that the information about the self is being processed along the exact same pathways as everything else, but it's just that we have a lot of information about the self. So we have a lot of things to relate it to and all these things. And so it's simply just depth of processing. There's nothing special about the information about the self. The other camp was like, no, the self is unique. It's this cognitive structure that's different than just normal processing streams that process just any kind of information. And this was really tough to kind of work out because behaviorally, you can't really prove anything. If you're just bringing people in, you're having them do these memory tasks, whatever, you can't really see whether there's different processing regions that are taking care of different kinds of information. And so it wasn't until we started sticking people in MRIs that we really started to work out this debate. So just know that kind of we had this camp that was all about whether or not the information was just being processed more deeply. It was still going through the exact same processing pipelines as everything else. And then you had this other camp that was like, no, there's unique brain structures that have to be dedicated to the self, that are just distinct from all these other processing regions that kind of handle this non-self information. And so there was this researcher, Bill Kelly, out of Dartmouth. My advisor actually worked pretty closely with all of these guys. Most of the self-other work comes out of Dartmouth. There were a bunch of really good researchers that kind of worked this stuff out. And he put together this whole study. He was using a trait adjective task, which basically was saying you'd put a word up on the screen. So it was ambitious or lazy or empathic or something like that. And they would ask whether or not that word was something that described you. So it was in relation to the self. It was a word that described another person. They used former President George W. Bush, who was the president at the time. Or was the word uppercase or lowercase, right? And so this gets at this idea that like we have one condition that's information about some just random person that we have kind of semantic knowledge about. There's this other condition that's just basically shallow processing, just like, is the word uppercase or lowercase? And then we had this other one that was, is this word related to the self? And what we found, or what he found, was that they were a lot better at remembering the words that were in relation to the self. So that was what we just kind of described, this kind of self-reference effect. But he found that this medial prefrontal cortex was really heavily active for the self condition and wasn't active for any of the other two. And that the level of the activity of the medial prefrontal cortex, so if that medial prefrontal cortex was really active while they were considering that word, they remembered that word later. And so this was evidence that kind of settled that debate that yes, there is this really unique structure in the brain that is handling self-relevant information. And this finding is extremely robust. This has been replicated a ton of times. So in my study that I just ran, I had a group of 6 people and I had them think about themselves or one of those other 5 people in their group. And in just one person, if I did a model and I said, show me where in the brain self is greater than other, this would light up with a p-value of like 9. Where a p-value of like 2 is significant. So that means that the activity here was like 9 times the standard deviation. So like this region is really, really heavily involved in self-referential processing, and it's very highly replicable. So we are like very sure that there is this region. We don't really know yet what's being processed there, what kind of information is really represented there, but we do know that it is related to the self in some way. So what they started to find out was that these people, when they were thinking about themselves, when they were making these trait judgments, am I lazy, am I adventurous, all of these kind of things, they were actually drawing on different kinds of information than when we make the same types of judgments about other people. And what a lot of these researchers are starting to think is that we are kind of, when we're trying to figure out who we are, we're really relying on these kind of prototypes of who we are, these summaries of personality traits. And we're not really thinking about particular instances. So if I was asked, am I adventurous? I'm not saying, okay, well, I went to Zion and that was adventurous, and I did this and that was adventurous. I can just, right off the bat, I can just say, yes, I am adventurous. Whereas when we're thinking about other people, we're starting to see a lot of evidence that we do rely on specific instances. If I were to ask, like whether or not Conrad was adventurous, I would try to think of like, do I know any instances when he was? That kind of thing, right? And this is still kind of new, but I'll show you some evidence that's kind of leaning this way. There's behavioral evidence that's in the book that I'm not going to get into today, but this is something that really kind of gets at that, is that amnesic patients. So these are patients that have severe retrograde amnesia. They don't have any memory for their entire life, but they're still able to describe their personality, who they are, what their traits are, and things like that. And it's not that they're just describing their personality, but that description matches with descriptions given by family members, by friends, by people that are close to them, right? So they have this insight into who they are, what they like, what their preferences, even though they don't remember anything about their lives, right? And so it's this idea that they're maybe not drawing on these memories. So what was interesting was that this same person, when they were asked to judge the traits of their daughter, they failed, right? And so they judged the traits of their daughter, and those traits were compared to other people that were like describing that person's personality, and they didn't match up at all. And so this person had a really hard time because they didn't have any memories of their daughter. They had a hard time kind of putting those things together. So there is something to this, but I completely agree. I don't think it's as clear cut. But it seems to be that even in these severe cases where you've lost all your memories, there's still something about the self that's kept intact. So something that we've kind of hinted at through this is that the self is not this one thing. It's composed of all these different types of information. And so even though like our self doesn't depend on memories, there's still a lot of our self that is involved with memories. When we talked about episodic memory in general, it was this idea that we were the agent in the story, right? That's what an episodic memory is, that we were experiencing it. We remember the context because we were there at a great time hiking in Zion. There's parts of ourselves that are just semantic knowledge, so just knowledge that we have that we don't really have any contextual information about. Like, I don't remember who told me that I was Scottish, but I am. There's another part where there's this agency side that kind of gets into the embodiment side of the self, right? I know that I'm the one that's moving this clicker around and pointing at the screen. This is my hand. That kind of gets into this last point. There's a part of the self where you're able to recognize that that's you in the mirror. That's you in the photo. You can look down at your feet and recognize that's my foot. So there's a lot going on with kind of putting together this self-concept. Which gets at the idea that this is probably a network that's handling the self. That the MPFC is probably where a lot of the integration is happening, of kind of putting all those pieces together, but that it kind of relies on all of these other regions to kind of work together and to integrate all that information. And the evidence that we started to get for that came from these kind of resting state studies, which looked at like what regions were online together when people weren't thinking about anything. And something that was just like really striking to these early MRI researchers is that during these MRI tasks, what is usually happening is that there's some kind of trial that they're doing. So it's like a memory task or something. And in between the trials, there's usually just a cross on the screen. And they're saying, okay, I want you to remember something, and then I want you to do nothing. And then I want you to remember something and then do nothing. And what they found is during those times when they were told to do nothing, when they were at rest, so to say, there was this network of brain regions that just would come on every time they weren't actively engaged in something external. And it was this idea, like the brain doesn't turn off, right? This is something that's been a problem with MRI in general for a really long time, is that we're always trying to compare to baseline, but this is baseline, right? When they're not doing anything, there's this whole network of regions that's online. And so it's like, no, your brain doesn't turn off when you're doing nothing. When you're sitting there and you're between tasks, what happens? You start daydreaming. You start thinking about like, what do I need to do after this? Do I need to go to the store and prep up because there's not going to be any toilet paper left? No. Sorry. But there's a lot going on during that time that's not necessarily baseline, and a lot of it is self-relevant. We're thinking about things that are important to us and things that we need to do and things that we just did or things that we're thinking about for the next test or something like that. And so what we started to kind of think about was, is self-referential thought something that has to be engaged in? We have to actively try to think about things related to the self. And a lot of researchers are saying, no, that's just the baseline activity. That when we're not doing anything, our brain is automatically thinking about the self, thinking about what's important to us and trying to put all of these goals and these behaviors in line with everything. And that's why they think that the MPFC is kind of really active during these baseline traits or the baseline tasks or in the absence of a task. And so they kind of talked about this. This whole network was called the default mode network before it was really linked to the self, because they were just like, oh, this is just default. This is when we're doing nothing. And then we started to realize, no, this is what's happening when we're doing social stuff, when we're thinking about ourselves, when we're thinking about other people. And a lot of it was just, it's like, if it's not externally focused, these are the brain regions that are internally focused, that are thinking about things that don't require any type of stimulus, simulating things and that kind of stuff. And so the researchers that discovered this, so this is that picture again, default mode network, they noticed that there was this really high metabolic rate during rest. That was kind of what we were just hinting at. These were the brain regions that they were just like, what is going on? Why is the brain going through so many resources when we're supposed to be doing nothing? Like, that just seems like so counterintuitive, right? These are the regions that are kind of a part of it. So MPFC is one that we've talked about a lot. The precuneus and the PCC are kind of back here near the parietal lobe. That's the back of the anterior cingulate cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, what the PCC is. The retrosplenial cortex, which we'll kind of get into on Monday. TPJ is heavily involved in theory of mind type stuff. And then we see kind of memory processes popping up and some inferior parietal lobe, which is tied to like attention mechanisms and things like that. So we see a lot of activity going on. And so what these people, they started to realize was that this activity was probably related to the self-reference, which we were just talking about. So thinking about what's important to us. And the people that discovered the default mode network came up with this sentinel hypothesis. And so they think that the default mode network is this way of really knowing what's going on around us all the time, really incorporating all of that information, making sure that we're in line with our goals and intentions, making sure that things that are changing around us are factored into those goals and intentions. Yeah. So just kind of reiterating that this is something that we believe is just kind of happening just at all times, that we're constantly engaged in this trying to figure out what's going on around us. And we think that this is kind of related to that delay activity that we talked about in the last lecture, that these neurons in the prefrontal cortex are kind of staying on and they're keeping these representations online that are important to us. Sweet. So this is what I was kind of getting at. So it's this idea that these networks, instead of just being kind of our baseline or our default way, it's actually really related to inwardly focused type reflection and thought processes and things like that, judgments and all that, thinking about our emotional states, all these different kind of things, just anything that doesn't involve any type of external stimulus, anything that's like triggering these processing pathways. And this is something that's really interesting about the default mode network. So it's connected to the medial temporal lobe, which is where all of the memories are stored. And it's really heavily tied to higher order processing areas. These are going to be like multimodal processing areas where a lot of integration has already happened. We've identified objects. We've identified where those objects are in space. Those are the areas that are linked to the default mode network. And it's kind of cool to think about, because if the default mode network has access to these high perceptual areas, it can turn on representations of things that have been stored. So if we've already identified an object, we can simulate that object now. We can turn it back on when we're just kind of thinking about it. And it's not connected to any of the primary sensory regions, which makes sense because it doesn't want to turn on little lines and edges. It wants to turn on full objects, like full perceptions. And none of that's really tied to actually initiating action. It's tied to just trying to understand what we should do. So there is some connections to like premotor areas, supplementary motor areas, but not directly to like primary motor or like basal ganglia or stuff like that. It's actually initiating the actions. And so this is what I was getting at, is this idea of simulation. So these tasks that really, really engage default mode network are ones where you're told to kind of go through these autobiographical memories to try to like relive like a hike that you just went on and kind of simulate yourself going back through that past experience. Tasks that have you think about your future self and what you would do in the future, navigating to different locations, things like that, taking someone else's perspective, evaluating kind of moral dilemmas. It's all about kind of simulating these scenarios in your head and putting yourself in those perspectives without any kind of external thing to get that started. So it really gets at this inward thought and this idea that we're having to kind of flexibly turn on all of these old perceptions of things and use them in flexible ways. That gets into the idea of working memory and how the prefrontal cortex can kind of get involved with stuff like that. Cool. Love this picture. Kind of a big deal because it gets into positivity bias, right? So this is something that's really interesting about humans. We have really unrealistic positive ideas about ourselves, right? So when they just go around and ask people, 70% of high school students report being above average leaders. Can't be true. There's an average for a reason. This one really hit home. 93% of college professors think they're above average at their work, right? I'm sure you've taken some classes from multiple people. I'm definitely one of them. More than 50% of people think they're above average intelligence, that they're above average physical attractiveness, all kinds of these different traits. And this is something that's really robust. They've done these studies numerous times, and people, it seems like it's kind of a protective thing, right? If I think that I'm above average, then it gives me motivation, it gives me purpose. And this also applies to future expectations, right? So people think that they're more likely to win the lottery and that they're more likely to not get divorced, even though the divorce rate is like 50%, right? It's not going to be me. Well, it's not going to be me. So they've done some studies to look at what's going on in the brain. My advisor actually did one. I don't have his study in here. It was a little bit more complex than the one we'll look at. But there definitely is something linked to our ability to be more positive, and there's some brain regions that are tracking that. So this study was very similar to ones that we've seen before. So they saw these descriptive judgments like I am talkative, and they were just kind of on a Likert scale. So like this is definitely not true, or yes, this is definitely true. And what we saw was that they tended to select more positive traits. And so if this had said, I am lazy, a lot of people are going to say that they're not, and then they're going to go home and eat a whole bag of chips. Whereas other people were kind of choosing, like if this were to say, like, I am ambitious, I am good looking, those kind of things, they're going to say a lot more about themselves in a positive way. And what we saw was that there was this brain region, the ventral anterior cingulate cortex. So don't really worry about ventral. I just kind of want you to know that the anterior cingulate cortex in general is tied to this stuff. So it's this region right here. This is really, really close to the MPFC. It's right next to that self region. And so they think that this ACC region is kind of pulling in a lot of the positivity and adding that to these self-judgments. And what you can also kind of get at too, and some studies have also shown that there's a lot of connections to nucleus accumbens and orbital frontal cortex is right here. All of those regions are really heavily tied with reward. And so this is kind of a really good candidate for positivity in general. It's like positive things are intrinsically rewarding. It's something that there's a researcher that thinks that the self is nothing but reward. That it's just like this activity that we're seeing in the MPFC is all about just deciding that this is good or not, right? It's an interesting perspective. And so this was another one. This is just some kind of convergent evidence. So this was when they were just imagining experiencing something positive happening to them versus something negative happening to them. So this is just more evidence that the anterior cingulate cortex is really tied into that positivity bias. Yeah. And so this is just kind of highlighting that point I was just getting at. So anterior cingulate cortex may be involved in kind of this protective type information. Something that is tough for me with these types of slides is that the cingulate cortex in general lights up for like everything. So it's showing to be a lot more active for these positive things. So it's definitely involved in this kind of positivity bias type thing. But like animal researchers, human researchers, the cingulate cortex is a super highway. If you look at, so this right here, right above the corpus callosum is the cingulate cortex, and it ties like everything together. There's tons of white matter tracts that go through there. And so it ends up getting activated for a bunch of different types of activities. So if someone were to tell you that the ACC just does this, be wary. I'm telling you that it's involved in it. So I like this picture. Pass, right? So when we're really biased about our positive traits, they're not delusional. Like they're unrealistic, but they're not like super far-fetched. We're still going to admit that we have negative traits, right? And so that's kind of throughout this whole study of things, like we notice that people still report negative traits, and that's really important. You have to know where your kind of weaknesses are when you're engaging with people socially. And that's something that's really important, ties into like social rules and all those kind of things. And having insight to that is something that the prefrontal cortex is really heavily involved with, because when we see people with OFC damage, we see that they have really, really unrealistic positive views. And that kind of leads, the fact that they can't recognize any of these negative traits that they have leads to a lot of their inappropriate social behavior. And this was known from studying a lot of these OFC lesion patients. And the researchers at the time kind of asked this question, like, are they being inappropriate because they don't have insight, or are they being appropriate because they don't actually know the rules? Are they not kind of keeping those rules in mind when they're engaged in these social situations? And they did this interesting study with these OFC lesion patients. They brought them in a room and they had them interact with this other person, and they videotaped the whole thing. And these OFC patients, or OFC lesion patients, a lot of the times would end up saying things that were just like extremely inappropriate and would just keep going like nothing had happened. There was no embarrassment in the moment. They didn't correct. They didn't realign the conversation or anything, even though the person was giving them very obvious cues that it was inappropriate, things like that. But they had them rewatch the video, and when they watched themselves, they were embarrassed, right? And so it was this idea that they know the rules. They know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, but in the moment, there's nothing tracking that. And so this was just kind of highlighting what I just got at, what the conclusion of that was, that they know the rules because they're embarrassed after seeing themselves on video. But in the moment, there's not this spontaneous self-reflection happening and trying to like understand whether or not they're going down the right path. And they're not taking cues or anything like that. So if you're going to take something from this slide, just know that it kind of helped to resolve that debate on the last one. That it's not that they don't know the rules, it's that there's not something monitoring the goal and the rule in the given moment. I want to do the last couple of slides. We'll see. So this was kind of getting back to the idea that that the default mode network in general is really heavily involved in simulation. And so we saw that there was this really heavy medial prefrontal cortex activity when people were imagining themselves in future states, or when they were simulating other people's minds or other times or other places. And this was a really interesting finding down here. So they had these studies where they were showing that like simulating your future self really heavily engages the medial prefrontal cortex. Well, there's this idea that there are some people that will take a lower amount of money now rather than wait for a lot of money later. And they found that the degree to which the medial prefrontal cortex is active when you're thinking about the future predicts whether or not you're going to be short-sighted or not. So people that are really good at simulating the future are the ones that are more likely to wait for the reward later. Kind of gets at this idea that you might be able to get better at simulating and about thinking about the future. We'll talk about some interesting stuff in the next lecture when we get into differences between the self and other. There's a researcher that finds when you're simulating your future self that it actually activates the same region as when you're thinking about other people. So like thinking about your future self is actually thinking about someone else in a weird way. I don't know. We'll get into it on Monday. But this is what I wanted to kind of get to was embodiment. And there's a really interesting disorder if you guys haven't heard of it before that we'll get into at the end. So embodiment kind of refers to this spatial unity that we have with our body, this sense of agency that we own our body in a way. And this TPJ region, which is one of the default mode network regions, this is all kind of default mode here, is really heavily involved in integrating body information with cognitive perceptual type information. And it's right around here. So this right angular gyrus, this is the reason I picked this photo. I apologize that it doesn't say TPJ on it. There was a surgeon that was doing brain surgery on someone that stimulated the right angular gyrus, which is right next to TPJ, kind of right in that same region. And when he kind of had a low stimulation, they felt like they were sinking into the bed or like they were falling off of a cliff. They had this falling type sensation. And then when the stimulation was turned up, they had this whole out-of-body experience. So they kind of saw themselves outside of their own body. They were like hovering above themselves and could see their own body. Crazy. We'll get into some possible biological explanations for this, because this is a very kind of trippy phenomenon that can get very metaphysical if you want to think about it that way. But there could be a reason for it. So this was just something I wanted to put up. This is kind of what someone having an out-of-body experience is experiencing. So you feel that you're not residing in your own body, and you feel like you're in a different body, and you can actually look down and see your other body. Kind of crazy. And there was this MRI study that was done before the stimulation. The surgeon had discovered this out-of-body stuff, and they had people view a picture with a person in it, and they were asked to try to see the scene from that other person's perspective. And they found that an area just right around where the one that the surgeon stimulated was active for this like simulation type activity of trying to simulate yourself from another person's perspective, or simulate a scene from another person's perspective. And so this region of the brain might kind of be involved in that kind of perspective taking thing. And that could be what's kind of creating this really weird out-of-body type experience. And when they had them just imagine rotating an object, they didn't see the same thing. So it seemed like it was specific to this kind of perspective taking idea. I'm going to skip this one. I'm not going to test you guys on this. I want to get to the end. They do think that this is kind of a sensory integration thing, that these multimodal processing regions kind of have some cross wiring. So you're seeing, you touch yourself, but you're kind of feeling it after you see it. And that like misalignment might be like engaging this weird perception that you're having. This is what I wanted to talk about right before we go. Have you guys heard of xenomelia? This is where people want to cut off their own limbs. It's insane, right? So it's this rare condition. These people feel like their leg is not their own, and their whole life just want to get it amputated. They'll go to doctors and ask doctors to amputate them. The doctors will say no, and a lot of them will get online and figure out how to do it themselves, and will do self-amputations. Really interesting that it usually only affects the left leg, which is really similar to what we saw with neglect, that it was only affecting the left side. But this was really interesting. So they did MEG on these patients, and they found that the signal wasn't there in the left leg region of the somatosensory cortex, that it just wasn't being activated. So they actually weren't getting a signal from the leg. And then they followed up and they did this structural study, and they also found that the cortical thickness for that region was a lot less. This again is one of those, is it the chicken or the egg thing? Did they lose the structural stuff because they were ignoring that leg? And did they lose the signal because they were ignoring that leg? Or was the signal and the structure never there, and that's why they don't feel like they even have that leg? Really interesting. Yeah, there's a whole documentary on this. If you guys look up xenomelia, it is fascinating. And yeah, and this was like, a lot of people thought it was purely psychiatric, and then they did these studies, and like it might not be. Crazy. So
if they amputate, does it, like, do they not have that problem?
They feel happy as hell after they amputated. It's crazy. They interview these people and they're just like, yes, this is how I was always supposed to be.
But like,
yeah.
They feel it when they cut it off?
Oh, like, do they still have like phantom limb type?
Yeah, or like, well, no, I meant like if they don't.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like while they're cutting it, do they not have the sensation?
Feel it, or would they just be like, oh, I just don't have this?
Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. If there's like no pain at all associated with it. I mean, there still was some signal. It just was like very, very diminished compared to the other. So I think they definitely could still feel it. And I'm sure their brain was just like, what the hell are you doing? Awesome. I will see you guys on Monday.